In the spring of 1979, a kiln manager named Hollis Crane stood at the edge of a river-bottom field in Cordell County and told the man who farmed it that the broken pots piling against his fence were garbage, that they would always be garbage, and that he ought to be grateful somebody was hauling them this far out of town for free. The man he said it to was 41 years old, and he did not argue. He had a hand on the top wire of that fence, and he was looking past Crane at the heap of shattered stoneware, glittering in the low light, and what he said back was 4 words long. 22 years later, in the autumn of 2001, a buyer for a hotel chain that put up lodges from the Gulf to the Northern Lakes wrote a single number on a purchase order and slid it across a plank table in a workshop that smelled of wet clay and wood smoke. That number, and the 22 years and 2 generations of patient stubbornness that stood between the insult and the order, are the whole of this story. Let me tell you about the man at the fence, because the kiln manager had him wrong from the first day, and being wrong about him cost the kiln everything in the end. His name was Mateo Reyes, and around Birchart Crossing he was known for 2 things. He was known for never raising his voice, and he was known for being able to look at a broken thing and tell you exactly why it broke. The second was the rarer gift: a wagon axle, a cracked foundation, a split seed corn that came up thin on the South 40, a churn that wept at the seam. Mateo would turn it over in his hands and find the flaw the way another man finds a familiar road in the dark. He had 80 acres of river-bottom ground that flooded 1 year in 5, and grew the best sweet corn in the county. The other 4, he had a wife named Avelia, who kept the books in a ledger with a cracked spine, and a son, Tomas, who was 9 that spring and already shadowing his father through the fields with a seriousness that worried his mother and pleased no one but Mateo. The kiln stood 3 miles up the county road on the edge of Birchart Crossing proper, and it had been there since before Mateo was born. The Crane family had run it for 2 generations. They made crocks and jugs and butter churns and the heavy stoneware bowls that every farm kitchen in 3 counties used for bread and brine, and they made them by the thousand, and roughly 1 in 9 came out of the kiln, cracked, warped, underfired, or split clean through. Those were the seconds. You cannot sell a churn that weeps at the seam. The kiln had been dumping its seconds for as long as anyone could remember, and for the last several years it had been dumping them at the low corner of Mateo's east fence line, where the county road bent, and the ground fell away toward the river, and nobody from town ever had cause to look. Hollis Crane was 48 that spring, a fluent and confident man who had taken over the kiln from his father and modernized it, and who genuinely believed the way a man believes the sun comes up, that a cracked crock was worth nothing. He was not a cruel man, I want to be clear about that, because the easy version of this story makes him a villain, and the true version is harder and better. He was a man whose arithmetic had never once failed him. He could tell you to the penny what a finished churn cost to make and what it sold for, and he could tell you that a broken one cost the same to make and sold for nothing. And from those 2 true facts, he had built a worldview in which broken stoneware was simply loss, a subtraction, a thing you paid to make disappear. He paid a teamster $4 a load to haul the seconds out to the river bend and tip them over Mateo's fence. He thought he was being neighborly by hauling them that far. The day he said it to Mateo's face was the day the teamster quit, and Crane drove the load out himself, and found the farmer standing at the corner of the fence looking at 12 years of accumulated wreckage. By then, the heap was the size of a small barn. Crane expected complaint. He got something stranger. Mateo asked him quietly whether the kiln would keep sending them. "As long as we fire, son, we'll have seconds," Crane said, easy and fatherly, leaning on the open door of his truck. "Be glad it's free. Anybody else would charge you to take it away." Mateo looked at the heap a moment longer. Then he said the 4 words, "The ones I told you," he said, and they were these: "Then keep them coming." Crane laughed, not unkindly, and drove back to town, and he told the story that evening as a joke about the simple farmer down at the river bend who'd thanked him for a pile of garbage. Everybody laughed. And Crane, it was a joke about a man too proud or too dim to admit he was being dumped on. To Mateo, it was the first day of a plan he had been turning over in his hands for a year, the way he turned over everything broken, looking for the reason it broke and the use that was left in it. Let me tell you what he had already figured out. Because this is where the mechanism begins, and the niche of this story is that the mechanism is real. A fired stoneware crock that comes out of the kiln cracked is not, in fact, worthless. It is a piece of vitrified clay, fired to better than 2,000 degrees, hard as slate and nearly as waterproof, that happens to be the wrong shape. Mateo had spent the previous winter walking the heap with a 4-pound hammer and a pair of his wife's kitchen tongs, and he had learned 3 things by hand that no spreadsheet in town knew. He had learned that the seconds broke along predictable lines, that a fired crock wall could be napped into flat shards the way a flint can be worked, with a controlled blow at the right angle, leaving a clean edge instead of a crumble. He had learned that the glaze that made a churn waterproof made a shard waterproof too. A hard glassy skin of amber and salt gray and the deep iron brown the kiln favored, colors no paint could match because they were burned into the clay itself. And he had learned the 3rd thing, the one that turned a curiosity into a living, in the floor of his own root cellar. The cellar floor had been bare dirt that turned to soup every wet spring. One February, idle and cold, Mateo had carried up a load of the flattest shards, bedded them in a mortar of lime and river sand, and tiled the cellar floor in a rough mosaic of broken crock. It took him a week. When the spring floods came that year, the cellar floor shed water like a duck's back and dried hard and cool, and the colors of it, the amber and the salt gray and the iron brown, all fitted together like the back of a turtle, were the most beautiful thing in the house. Orvelius stood at the bottom of the stairs with a lamp the night he finished, and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "People would pay for that." She was right, and it would take 11 more years for the world to agree with her. But she was right that night. So when Hollis Crane drove out to the fence that spring morning and told him the heap was garbage, Mateo already had a tiled cellar floor and a head full of arithmetic of his own. He knew that the kiln threw off roughly 900 seconds a year. He knew that each broken crock, napped down, yielded between 12 and 20 usable flat shards. He knew that a square foot of his cellar floor had taken about 40 shards. The math was not complicated, and it was the opposite of Crane's math. Where Crane saw 900 subtractions a year, Mateo saw something on the order of 14,000 shards a year, falling over his fence for free, in colors no one could buy, hard as slate, waterproof, and his for the hauling. He did not tell anyone what the math was. He just said, "Then keep them coming," and went home and began to sort. Let me tell you how a thing like this starts, because it does not start with an empire. It starts with one floor at a time and a man learning his own trade with nobody to teach him. The first thing Mateo built for money was a hearth. A neighbor named Dorsey Pike, who farmed the quarter section up the road and had watched the cellar floor go in, asked Matteo in the fall of 1980 whether he could face the front of a fireplace with the same broken crockwork. Matteo said he could. He spent 3 Sundays at it, napping shards at the kitchen table, while Tomas, 10 now, sorted them by color into coffee cans. Amber here, gray here, brown here, and when it was done, the Pike's fireplace looked like something out of an old country church, a wall of fitted stone-colored glass that threw the firelight back in 100 warm fragments. Dorsey paid him $18 and a side of pork. Within a month, 2 more neighbors had asked. Within a year, Matteo had a list in the back of Ovalia's cracked ledger, and the list had names on it from 2 towns over. He kept farming. I want to be honest about that because the temptation in a story like this is to say the man quit the land and chased the new thing. And he did not. The corn went in every spring and came out every fall, and the tile work happened in the winters and the dry spells and the long evenings. And for the first 6 years it was a sideline that paid for seed, and a new transmission, and 1 good year a second-hand pickup. What changed slowly, almost too slowly, to see, was the heap. The heap at the fence corner stopped growing. Crane's teamster, rehired, still tipped a load over the wire every few weeks, but Matteo was hauling shards out of it faster than the kiln poured them in, and by 1984 the small barn of wreckage was down to a low ridge, and Matteo had built a sorting shed beside it, with bins for color and grade. And the thing that had been a dump was beginning to look like a yard. Hollis Crane noticed none of this because he had no reason to drive to the river bend, and because in his ledger the seconds were still a subtraction, still $4 a load to make them disappear, and a thing that is only a cost in your books is a thing you stop looking at. Let me tell you about the teaching part now, because Matteo did something. Most men who stumble onto a good thing never do. He wrote it down. In the winter of 1985, he started keeping a second ledger. Not the money one, but a working one. And in it he recorded everything he learned about the broken crock, the way a man records the breeding of his cattle. He learned that the underfired seconds, the soft ones that hadn't reached temperature, were worthless for floors because they drank water and crumbled in a freeze, but that they could be reground and worked back into his bedding mortar as grog, which is what potters call fired clay ground up and added back to raw clay to keep it from cracking, and which made his mortar stronger and let it grip the shards. He learned that the salt-glazed pieces, the gray ones with the orange peel skin, were the hardest and the most waterproof, and he saved those for the floors of dairies and spring houses where water stood. He learned that a shard heated gently and quenched would craze, would web over with fine cracks that caught the light, and that people would pay more for a crazed amber tile than a plain one, and so he learned to ruin them in exactly the right way on purpose. None of this was magic. All of it was attention, paid to one material over years, by a man who had nowhere else to be. I will tell you the names of the colors as he named them in that ledger, because they matter later. The amber he called honey, the salt gray he called river ice, the deep iron brown he called plowed ground, honey, river ice, and plowed ground. A buyer would write those words on a purchase order one day and would not know he was quoting a farmer's private dictionary. Thomas grew up in the sorting shed. By the time he was 15 in 1985, he could nap a clean shard faster than his father, and he had an eye for laying a floor that Matteo himself admitted was better than his own, a feel for where a piece of honey wanted to sit against a piece of plowed ground so the whole floor breathed. The boy had his father's quiet and his mother's book's sense both. Where Matteo built each floor by feel, Tomas began drawing them first on butcher paper. Planning the color runs the way you'd plan a quilt, and the planned floors sold for more than the felt ones because a buyer could see what he was getting before a single tile went down. This is the part of the story where the conventional path and the true path begin to run side by side. So let me tell you what was happening at the kiln while the Reyes family sorted broken crocks by lamplight. Through the mid-1980s, Hollis Crane did exactly what a confident, intelligent man does when his model is working. He doubled down. The old wood-fired kiln that had thrown off 1 second and 9 was slow and finicky, and Crane replaced it in 1986 with a new gas-fired tunnel kiln on a bank loan, a long brick throat that ran day and night and fired stoneware 4 times faster than the old beehive. The new kiln cut his seconds from 1 in 9 to 1 in 20, which, by his arithmetic, was pure gain, less waste, less subtraction, more churns out the door. He took on a contract to supply a regional chain of farm and feed stores with stoneware Crocks under the chain's own label. A steady order, the kind of contract a banker loves. And he borrowed again to add a second line. By 1988, the Crane Kiln was the largest stoneware works in the river counties, and Hollis Crane was by every measure his world knew how to take a success. He stopped sending seconds to the river bend around. Then, not as a favor, but because the new kiln made so few of them that he sold most as factory flawed at the gate for pennies, and the few that were truly broken, he ground up himself and fed back into his clay, having reinvented, on a small scale and for his own reasons, the grog trick Mateo had worked out years before. The loads stopped coming over the fence. By that point, it did not matter. Mateo had a ridge of sorted shards in his yard that would last him years, and he had stopped needing the kiln at all. And Tomas, 18 now, had begun driving to estate sales and farm auctions across 3 counties, buying up old, broken crockery by the wagon load for $1 a barrel. Because the family's hunger for broken stoneware had outgrown what one kiln could spill. Let me tell you about the spring of 1989, because that was the year the 2 paths first crossed in public. And it is the closest thing this story has to the scene where the credentialed man dismisses the craftsman to his face. The county fair at Burchard Crossing had a building they called the Home Arts Hall, and that year, for the first time, Tomas entered a tabletop section of broken crock tile, a 2-foot square of honey and river ice, and plowed ground laid out in a pattern he had drawn that ran like water down a slope. It won a ribbon. More than that, it drew a crowd, the kind of slow farm fair crowd that stands and looks and figures. And among the people who stopped to look was Hollis Crane, who was there with a booth of his own, showing the new chain label Crocks. Crane stood over the tile square a long moment. He was 60 by then, silver and easy and prosperous, and he recognized the colors before he recognized the boy. He recognized his own glaze. He looked from the tile to the placard, with the Reyes name on it, and something crossed his face that was not anger. Not yet. Just the small private vertigo of a man seeing his garbage in a glass case with a ribbon on it. "Where'd you get the stoneware, son?" he asked. He asked it pleasantly. He genuinely did not know. "You gave it to us," Thomas said. He was 19, and he said it level, the way his father said things. 12 years over our fence at the river bend, my father said. Keep them coming. There was a silence in the Home Arts Hall that a few people noticed, and most did not. Crane looked at the tile a while longer. Then he did the thing that I told you he would do. The thing that made him not a villain, but a man with a model that had never failed him. And the model spoke through his mouth before his better self could catch it. "That's a clever little hobby," he said. But it doesn't scale, son. You've got a pile of junk and a lot of time. The minute you have to pay for the clay, the whole thing falls apart. I know the numbers on stoneware better than any man alive. You can't make a living off other people's mistakes. He said it kindly. He even meant it kindly, as a warning from an old hand to a young one. Then he straightened his jacket and went back to his booth of perfect Crocks. To Crane, it was sound advice from the man who knew the arithmetic. To Tomas, it was a sentence he would carry for 12 more years. He did not answer it. His father had taught him that the number answers. The man stays quiet. He took his ribbon and his tile square home, and that night at the kitchen table with Avelia's ledger open between them, the three of them did something they had never done before. They decided to find out whether the old man was right. Let me tell you about the years between 1989 and the structural shock, because this is where the patient path does its patient work, and it is not dramatic, and that is the point. They tested Crane's claim directly. The old man had said the whole thing fell apart the minute you had to pay for the clay. So Thomas kept careful books on exactly that, on what it cost to buy broken crockery by the barrel at auction, instead of taking it free over the fence. The answer surprised even them. Broken, stoneware, fired and hard and useless to everyone else, sold at farm auctions for almost nothing, because to everyone but the Reyes family it was exactly what Crane said. It was garbage. A wagon load that yielded enough shards for 40 square feet of floor cost Tomas about $2. The clay, in other words, even bought, was nearly free because the world had agreed with Hollis Crane that it was worthless, and that agreement was the very thing that kept it cheap. The old man's certainty was the foundation of the Reyes family's margin. The more sure the world was that broken stoneware was garbage, the less they had to pay for it. By 1992, the sideline was no longer a sideline. Mateo 54 gave up the row crops on the worst 40 acres, the part that flooded, and put up a proper workshop, a long open-sided shed with sorting bins down one wall and a napping bench down the other, and a kiln of his own, a small one, not for making crocks, but for crazing and color-shifting the shards on purpose. Thomas, 22, married a woman named Selha Marrow from over in the next county, and Selha could draw, really draw, and she took over the patterns from butcher paper and put them on proper grid paper and began naming the standard layouts so a buyer could order one by name. They called the running water pattern Spillway. They called the turtleback mosaic of the original cellar floor Old Cellar. They called a tight herringbone of river ice Frost Run. The names were plain and the floors were beautiful, and the orders came from farther and farther away. They still farmed. The good 40 acres of river bottom still grew the best sweet corn in the county, and Mateo still walked it every morning because a man does not stop being a farmer because he has learned a second trade, and because the corn money carried them through the slow winters before the tile work could. The ratio had turned, though. By 1995, the tile brought in $3 for every one the corn brought, and Ophelia, keeping both columns in the cracked ledger, had begun to think of the corn as the thing that kept them honest, and the tile as the thing that kept them. Let me tell you a smaller thing that happened in 1995, because it shows you the kind of people they had become, and it pays off at the end. A dairy 2 counties over had a milkhouse with a failing floor, and the dairyman, a careful old Dutchman named Reuben Holt, drove all the way to the river bend because he'd heard the Reyes floors shed water and didn't crack in a freeze. He wanted his milkhouse done in salt gray river ice because it would match the cool of the place. Mateo laid it himself. The last big floor he ever laid with his own hands, 3 weeks of work. And when it was done, Holt asked him what made it last, where concrete cracked. Matteo did not give him a speech. He picked up a leftover shard and a whole unbroken crock that had come in a job lot, and he set the crock on the floor and tapped the shard against it. "Same clay," he said. "Same fire. The whole one shattered the day it was born, and the broken one's been underfoot 50 years, and will be here when we're gone." He set the shard in Holt's hand. Nothing wrong with it was ever the clay's fault. It was the shape. We just gave it a new shape. That was the longest Matteo Reyes ever talked about his trade to a customer, and Holt remembered it, and Holt told it to a man at a hotel chain 6 years later, and that is how the number on the purchase order found its way to the plank table. I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the structural shock. Now, because the universe in this kind of story is just but slow, and it does not reward the patient man by magic. It rewards him by breaking the thing that the confident man built on sand, and the breaking, when it comes from outside, impersonal and fair. In the autumn of 2000, the price of natural gas tripled. I want to slow down here, because this is the hinge. The whole story turns on, and it is not a storm or a blight or a villain's scheme. It is a number on an invoice. The gas-fired tunnel kiln that Hollis Crane had borrowed to build, the long brick throat that fired 4 times faster than the old wood beehive, and it cut his seconds from 1 in 9 to 1 in 20, ran on natural gas, day and night, and its whole advantage, its whole reason for being, was that it was cheap to run. When the price of gas tripled inside of one winter, the arithmetic that Crane knew better than any man alive turned over and bit him. A stoneware crock that had cost him $1.10 to fire now cost him better than $3. And the chain that bought his Crocks under their own label had a contract that fixed the price, and the contract did not care what gas cost. He was firing Crocks at a loss and bound by paper to keep firing them. He did what a confident man does. He believed it was temporary. He borrowed against the kiln to cover the winter, certain the price would fall. It did not fall. He cut the second line and laid off half his men in the spring of 2001, and the chain, seeing him stagger, found another supplier and let the contract lapse rather than renew it. And by the summer of 2001, the largest stoneware works in the river counties, and here's the part that the old wood kiln would have survived, and the new one could not. The old beehive kiln had been slow and wasteful and thrown off 1 second in 9, and it had run on wood. The family cut themselves, and it had no fixed costs to speak of, and it could fire when there was an order and sit cold when there wasn't. It was inefficient, and its inefficiency was a kind of resilience, because it owed nothing to anyone and bent with the weather. The new kiln was efficient, and its efficiency was a kind of rigidity, because every efficiency it bought had been bought on credit, and on the assumption that the inputs would stay cheap, and when one input quadrupled, the whole tight machine had no give in it anywhere. What is rigid brakes? What bends survives. Crane had spent 15 years making his kiln rigid and calling it progress, and the river counties had called it progress with him, and the gas price did not care what anyone called it. Let me tell you what was happening at the river bend that same summer, because the contrast is the whole argument of this story, and I will lay it out item by item. The Reyes workshop used almost no gas. Its only kiln was the small one for crazing shards fired a few days a month. Its raw material was broken stoneware, which got cheaper, not dearer. The worse the economy got, because more old farms were selling out and more barrels of broken crockery were coming up at auction at $1 a barrel. Its labor was the family and 3 local men they had trained, paid weekly out of a business that owed the bank nothing, because Mateo Reyes had never in his life borrowed money. He could not pay back by hand. To the gas company, the autumn of 2000 was a windfall. To Hollis Crane, it was ruin. To Mateo and Tomas Reyes, it was the cheapest their raw material had ever been, and the busiest their order book had ever looked, because a tile floor that cost nothing to fire and never cracked in a freeze, the same number that broke the kiln barely moved the needle at the river bend, and where it did move it, it moved in their favor. This is the 2 kinds of knowing that the whole story has been about. Hollis Crane knew one thing, wide and shallow and confident. He knew the price of everything in the stoneware trade to the penny, and he had built a machine perfectly tuned to that price, and he had mistaken the price for the world. Mateo Reyes knew one thing, narrow and deep and patient. He knew exactly why a fired crock breaks, and exactly what is left in it after it does, and he had built a living on the one thing in the trade that could not be taken from him by a market, because he had built it on what other men threw away. When the market turned, the wide, shallow knowledge shattered along its fixed lines like an under-fired crock in a freeze, and the narrow, deep knowledge bent and held. Let me tell you about the day the buyer came, because the number is close now. Reuben Holt, the dairyman with the River Ice Milk House, had sold his dairy in 2000 and gone to work as a maintenance manager for a hotel chain that built timber lodges, the kind with big stone fireplaces and floors meant to look like they'd always been there. In the autumn of 2001, that chain was building 4 new lodges and wanted floors and hearths that read as old and handmade and local, and could not be bought off a pallet. And Holt told the buyer about a milk house floor he'd had laid 6 years before by a quiet farmer at a river bend. A floor of broken crock that shed water and never cracked and looked like the back of a turtle, honey and river ice and plowed ground. He told the buyer the farmer's own words, the ones about the clay and the shape and a new shape, and the buyer drove out to Cordell County to see for himself. His name was Aldous Vane, and he was a careful man with a clipboard, and he was not at all sure this was real until he walked into the Reyes workshop and saw the bins of sorted shards by color and grade running the whole length of the shed, and Selha's pattern grids pinned along the walls, spillway and old cellar and frost run, and Tomas, 31 now, napping a clean honey shard on the bench without looking down at his hands. Mateo, 63, sat on a stool by the door, and he let his son do the talking, because the trade had passed to Tomas the way the corn ground had passed to Mateo by working it. Vane wanted floors and hearths for 4 lodges. He wanted them in the Reyes patterns. He had done his own arithmetic on the drive out, comparing the broken crock floor to imported tile and to cut flagstone, and he had a figure in his head he expected to argue down. He named the square footage. Tomas named a price per foot, level, the way his father named things, neither low nor high. Just true. Vane did the multiplication on his clipboard. Then he wrote the number on the purchase order and slid it across the plank table. The order was for 40,000 square feet of broken crock tile, hearths included, across 4 lodges, to be delivered over 18 months. The number on the purchase order, the full value of the contract, was 410,000. Nobody spoke for a moment. The workshop smelled of wet clay and wood smoke, and outside the small kiln ticked as it cooled, and Mateo Reyes sat on his stool by the door and did not say a word. He had been told 22 years before, by a man who knew the numbers better than anyone alive, that he could not make a living off other people's mistakes. He had been told 12 years before that it was a clever little hobby that didn't scale and would fall apart the minute he had to pay for the clay. The clay had never cost him more than $2 a barrel. The hobby had just been handed $410,000. He did not gloat. There was no one to gloat to. Ophelia stood in the workshop door with the cracked ledger against her chest, and she met her husband's eyes across the room, and that was the whole celebration. Two people in their 60s looking at each other over the head of a buyer doing sums. Then Matteo got up off the stool and went out to walk the corn, because it was the right time of evening to walk the corn, and the corn did not care about purchase orders. Let me tell you what happened to Hollis Crane, because the niche this story belongs to does not punish the confident man. It corrects him, and the correction is the better ending. The Crane kiln failed that winter. The bank called the note in January of 2002, and the gas-fired tunnel kiln, the largest stoneware works in the river counties, went quiet, and the brick throat that had run day and night for 15 years went cold and stayed cold. Crane was 71. He had spent his whole life certain of an arithmetic that had finally, at the time horizon that mattered, turned out to be wrong. Not because he was stupid, he was not stupid, but because he had measured only what was easy to count and had counted broken stoneware as nothing. When the kiln's assets were sold off that spring, there was among the lots the kiln's accumulated stock of seconds, the broken crocks and warped churns it had ground up or sold for pennies, several tons of it heaped in the back lot. Thomas drove up to Burchard Crossing to bid on it because it was good clay, and the price would be nothing. And he was standing in the cold back lot of the dead kiln when Hollis Crane came out to watch the sale of the thing he had built. The two of them stood by the heap of broken stoneware, the old confident man and the patient one's son, and for a while neither said anything. Then Crane asked the question that was the real end of his long certainty, and he asked it plainly, the way a man asks who has finally run out of the answer he was sure of. "How did you know?" he said. "All those years. How did you know it was worth something and I didn't?" Tomas thought about it. He could have said something hard. He did not, because his father had raised him, and his father did not say hard things to broken men. "You knew what it cost to make," Tomas said. "We knew what it could still do." He picked up a shard from the heap, a piece of honey amber with the kiln's old glaze still bright on it, and he turned it over, the way his father turned things over, looking for the flaw and the use. Both, it was never garbage. It was just the wrong shape. He set the shard in the old man's hand, the same gesture his father had made in the milk-house 6 years before, the gesture that had carried all the way to a buyer's table. Nothing wrong with it was ever the clay's fault. Hollis Crane stood holding the shard a long time. Then he did the thing the old version of him could never have done. He asked Tomas to teach him. He was 71 and bankrupt, and he stood in the ruins of his own kiln and asked the man whose family had built a living on his garbage to show him how it was done, and Tomas, because he was his father's son, said yes. Crane spent the last good years of his life at the river bend, not as an owner, he had nothing to own with, but as a sorter, a patient old man with a good eye who learned at last to see what was left in a broken thing instead of only what it had cost. He turned out to be good at it. The wide, shallow knowledge that had failed him was not worthless either. He knew glazes and clay bodies better than anyone, and he taught Tomas things about why a shard crazed the way it did that even Matteo had only known by feel. The two kinds of knowing, the wide and the deep, finally sat at the same bench, and The floors got better for it. Let me tell you how it stands now, and then I will tell you the one thing this whole story has been trying to say. The Reyes workshop is still at the river bend. It still buys broken stoneware by the barrel at farm auctions, and the price is still almost nothing because the world still mostly agrees with the Hollis Crane, who stood at the fence in 1979, that a broken crock is garbage, and that agreement is still the foundation of the margin, and there is a justice in that the family has never stopped appreciating. Thomas runs it now. Mateo is too old to nap a shard, but not too old to sit on the stool by the door and tell you why a floor will last or fail before the first tile goes down. Sell has patterns shipped to lodges and lake houses and churches in a dozen states. The river ice milkhouse floor that Reuben Hoke commissioned is still down, still shedding water, the day it was laid, more than a quarter-century gone. The good 40 acres of river bottom still grow the best sweet corn in the county, and Mateo still walks it in the evenings when the light goes low and amber across the field, the color he named honey in a ledger 40 years ago. And the corn still does not care about purchase orders, and that is exactly why he walks it. A man needs one thing in his life that cannot be sold. Let me tell you the thing now, plainly, because the story has earned it. There are two ways to know the worth of a thing. You can know what it costs, which is the easy knowledge, the kind you can put in a column and add up and feel certain about, the kind Hollis Crane built a kiln on and the river counties called progress. Or you can know what it can still do, which is the hard knowledge, the slow kind, the kind you only get by turning the broken thing over in your hands 1,000 times until it tells you the truth, the kind Mateo Reyes built a life on at the corner of a fence where the road bent and nobody looked. The first kind of knowing is faster, and it is usually right. And it will leave you at the one moment that decides everything, holding a number that has turned to nothing in your hand. The second kind is slow, and it is often dismissed as a clever little hobby, and it does not scale. The experts will tell you the minute you have to pay for the clay. The clay, though, was never the cost. The clay was nearly free, because the whole confident world had agreed it was worthless, and their agreement was the gift. What it cost was the 12 years at the fence, and the 10,000 shards napped at a kitchen table by lamplight, and the patience to take a thing the world had thrown away and ask it, again and again, not what went wrong, but what was left. Hollis Crane was not wrong that the Crocks were broken. He was wrong about what broken means. A broken crock is not the end of a crock. It is fired clay, hard as slate, waterproof, in colors no one can buy, waiting on the only thing it ever needed, which was a man patient enough to give it a new shape. Nothing wrong with it was ever the clay's fault. It was the shape. And a shape, unlike a market, is something a patient man can change. The corn went amber in the low light, and the old man walked the row, and behind him in the workshop the kiln ticked as it cooled, and the bins of broken things sat sorted and waiting, honey and river ice and plowed ground, for the hands that knew what they were still good for.